When we're out with our cameras photographing the landscape, I do think that we become more aware of the beautiful planet that we live on. On the other hand, sometimes we do take things for granted just because it's there. Now, water is such an essential substance to maintain life as we know it, and what a wonderful earthly element to be able to photograph. Now, this video is a documentation of my own works, showing the beauty of this incredible mass that covers approximately 70% of the Earth's surface. So over the years I've amassed many images of water, just trying to show its beauty and elegance. So I'm so grateful for living in this technological era that we live in now. I can now share my pictures with you rather than print stuck in a box in a cupboard somewhere, in the hope that the video will inspire you to go out with your cameras and make a study of water and its movements, texture and grandeur. Using the camera, we can capture it in ways the eye cannot see it. And for those that are interested, I'll leave technical details of the camera, lens and film I use for each photograph. Using our cameras, we have the ability to control time and motion, and water is a fantastic subject to use time and motion on. We can blur the water, we can freeze it, we can photograph it in different ways, just to create different looking photographs that have more of an artistic feel. Now, there are a few things to take into consideration when photographing water. Now, take this picture as an example. Late evening sun reflecting off the sea's surface. Now, if I'd have used a polarizer filter to remove some of the reflections, it would have taken the dynamic look out of this picture. So don't always think that you have to use the polarizer. For black and white work, it can sometimes work against you. So always keep that in mind. If you want this dynamic look, don't use a polarizing filter. Now, this picture of the waterfall, I used a shutter speed of 1/15 of a second. Now, that gave me the blur in the water, but it also retained some textural detail. And I like to do that rather than use a very long exposure that gives this milky look, for a couple of reasons. I like to see the texture in the picture, but when you print the picture it looks much better with texture in those white areas. Another important area is exposure. When you're photographing water, there's such a big contrast range between the white water and the surrounding shadows. You have to get the exposure balanced so you get some shadow detail, but you don't blow the whites in the water. And when I say blow, turning them to pure white with no detail, because when you print again you'll just get a white blob on the paper. So get the exposure right on the whites, and if you're using a spot meter, using large format cameras, you can develop to that dynamic range, or you can simply spot meter from the white, place it on zone 8 and let the shadows fall where they're going to fall. If you're using a digital camera, I would always advise to get the whites exposed correctly and open up the shadows when you edit the picture. Or with digital you can do multiple exposures and blend those together. It's a lot easier with digital photographing water than it is with a film camera, because it's not always easy to get the two negatives where you're doing different exposures registered correctly together. I think film has a better dynamic range than digital. People might argue that with correct exposure on one shot to get detail in the shadows and the highlights using film. And when I say film, I'm talking about negative film, black and white negatives, colour negatives. They have a tremendous range from the deepest shadows to the brightest highlights, as I say, if exposed correctly. But that doesn't apply to slide film, which has a much smaller dynamic range. Water is all around us, and you don't just have to photograph waterfalls. In these next three pictures, taken at the coast on the wet sand, the light coming down on the subjects casts a shadow onto the water, creating a reflection. And if you can include people within the image, you can get some really interesting results. This next image, taken at Blackrock Sands in Wales, the low sun was casting this lovely shadow on the wet sand and giving this lovely textural quality. Without this wetness, this picture wouldn't have had the same dynamic look. Try and look for static objects within the water that contrast with the blur. This picture, the heron was kind enough to stay completely still while I took this picture at a slow shutter speed to get the blur in the water, and it just gives a different feel to the picture, because we've got the static image contrasting with the movement of the water. This simple picture of a branch sticking out of the water, breaking the flow of the water, perfectly sums up what the eye can't see. The long exposure has created this lovely blur in the water going over the twig, and then it's revealed the lines of the water as the water's flowing, creating two versions of blur in one picture. So sometimes the eye doesn't see everything. We enter a different world when we're using long exposures. Motion blur is more apparent the nearer the subject is to the camera. So in this picture we've got the breaking wave in the foreground creating this interesting motion blur, and in the background we've got the little fishing boat, and yet that looks reasonably sharp. So the blur is more effective the nearer it is to the lens. The further away, the blur is not as apparent, and that's how I got this effect in this photograph. Sometimes simple pictures can be very effective. This is a very tiny waterfall, and I use my 4x5 camera and use some front movements just to get the area that you see in the picture now in focus, and the rest going out of focus. By doing that and getting a dark background and a dark foreground, the image takes on a certain glow to it. So always be aware of your background and your foreground for creative effects. Wherever there's water, just think out of the box, experiment, and try and come up with images that are somehow different. You don't always have to use a slow shutter speed. You can use a fast shutter speed to freeze the motion of the water. This is not the actual building at Salts Mill, it's the reflection of the mill in the canal. Try to compose your pictures in a way that complement the flow of the water, that gives a much stronger visual effect. Photographing water at night, it's exciting, it can be very challenging, but also very rewarding. And as we all know, at 0 degrees Celsius, water, as if by magic, changes from a liquid into a solid. And in this picture, it's turned to snow and turned an otherwise ordinary picture into a dramatic winter scene. As the temperature plummets further down, water starts to freeze into blocks of ice, and it's a great opportunity to get out with your camera and capture the change in the landscape. And finally, a few images created by a camera that has no lens, and it's a natural in creating blur, not just in water but in everything, but it works particularly well with water. And yes, you've guessed it, the pinhole camera. Water takes on many shapes, textures, forms, patterns. It truly is a magical substance, but not only magical in its own right, it's a magical thing to photograph. So I hope this video inspires you to go out with your cameras, to study water, to take photographs with long exposures, short exposures, take pictures at night, photograph winter scenes, ice, snow. It can be and is a very rewarding way to capture images. So that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear your comments on the pictures. If you like this video, please give me a like. Better still, subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell. If you have any questions, please leave them below and I'll get back to you. And as I always say, stay safe, and I'll see you all in the next video.